By the year 2030, poor mental health is projected to cost the global economy approximately $6 trillion a year. Inside the individual firm, however, this multi-trillion-dollar figure rarely shifts operational priorities. This is a standard 5x5 risk assessment matrix. Managers map a threat based on its probability and the damage it causes, its severity. When evaluating psychological distress, safety professionals drop this hazard into the lower left quadrant, labeling the risk occasional and the severity marginal. This classification happens because managers gauge the severity of mental distress almost exclusively by tracking productivity loss through sickness absence. They count the empty desks. Relying on sick leave to calculate risks severely misrepresents the true operational hazard of a distressed workforce. Measuring this threat by physical absence ignores the much larger, hidden cost of impaired cognitive presence on the job. The miscalculation in standard risk assessments becomes visible when we track actual employee behavior through a longitudinal lens. The Household Income and Labor Dynamics in Australia survey, or HILDA, provides this exact longitudinal dataset. This visualization maps over 70,000 person-year observations across 14 years. Researchers first tested absenteeism. The data shows high psychological distress increases sick leave by a factor of only 1.13. Financially, this results in an additional cost of just $99 per year. This figure mathematically confirms the manager's initial bias. At less than $100 per employee, the severity of the hazard remains categorized as marginal. If sickness absence is the only measurement tool an organization uses, psychological distress will always appear to be a negligible financial risk. The $99 conclusion relies on standard cross-sectional workplace surveys, which contain a serious methodological flaw. Those surveys compare a distressed person to a completely different non-distressed person. They fail to account for the unobserved underlying variables separating two entirely different human beings. To fix this, researchers applied fixed effects regression mapping to the HILDA dataset. Instead of comparing different people, this longitudinal model tracks the exact same individual over time to isolate within-person variance. It holds static variables like sex, education, and baseline health mathematically constant, calculating work output changes only when that individual shifts from low to high distress. Filtering out the confounding demographic noise leaves a clear causative relationship between mental health and productivity. Isolating within-person variance is the only mathematically sound way to uncover the true operational impact of a shift in an employee's mental state. With the fixed effects law in place, researchers turned away from the flawed absenteeism metric and measured a different variable entirely: presenteeism. The data defines presenteeism as showing up to work while unwell, accomplishing less than normal, and executing tasks less carefully. Because presenteeism is recorded as a binary outcome, did the employee exhibit the behavior, yes or no, the researchers applied a fixed effects logistic regression model. Shifting to high distress yields an odds ratio of 19.24, making an employee nearly 20 times more likely to exhibit presenteeism. Multiplying days worked on well by a 50% productivity loss and daily wages reveals a massive $3,656 annual cost, dwarfing the $99 absenteeism calculation. The financial damage of a physically present but mentally distressed worker is nearly 37 times greater than if they had simply stayed home. Cost establishes the severity of the hazard. To accurately classify the operational threat, we must also determine its probability. Organizations need to know the statistical likelihood of an employee actively developing high psychological distress while on the job. The HILDA panel data tracks exactly how many workers transition between distress states over time. This chart maps the transition. Nearly 20% of workers who started with a low baseline moved to an elevated state of distress. Roughly 14.7% moved to moderate distress, and 4.5% moved to high distress. The data reveals a fluid state affecting a significant cross-section of the core workforce. The underlying mechanism driving this transition is explained by the job demands control model. Organizational environments that enforce high job demands while offering employees low decision-making latitude actively accelerate the transition into high distress. Modern operational structures often breed this hazard. Moving into high distress is a highly probable systemic event, detached from isolated personal issues. We return to the standard 5x5 risk assessment matrix, where the hazard was incorrectly mapped. Applying longitudinal data, we know nearly 20% of the workforce transitions into elevated distress, pushing the probability axis from occasional to probable. Factoring in the logistic regression data, specifically the $3,656 presenteeism multiplier, the severity axis jumps from marginal to critical. Management originally assumed they were capturing the full cost of the hazard by tracking absenteeism, but that metric accounted for less than 3% of the actual financial impact. Mapped correctly, psychological distress is empirically a probable and critical operational threat. Operations managers and safety professionals must finally stop treating mental health as an intangible, secondary human resources concern. Implementing workplace health promotion programs and job control interventions are mandatory Tier 1 risk controls. Measuring human capital with the same rigor as physical assets allows organizations to identify and recapture the capacity lost to psychological distress.